Once upon a time, not in a castle, but in a dusty old kingdom where kings wore chainmail instead of crowns and popped out of nowhere wielding swords like tax-evading magicians, there lived a man who would become more than a king. He would become a legend. Not a small legend, mind you. Not a "someone might mention you in a wine-stained epic poem" legend. This was Charles the Great, Charlemagne to the Latins, Karl der Grosse to the Germans, and Carolus Magnus to the folks who liked their history spicy with extra vowels. And if you don't know him yet, buckle up. He was the grandson of Charles Martel, a man nicknamed the Hammer, because apparently in those days you couldn't get famous unless your name sounded like a medieval WWE wrestler. Charlemagne didn't just inherit his grandfather's talent for clobbering enemies, he inherited Europe. And then he went and stitched that fragmented, squabbling, forested mess into something resembling a continent. Under his rule, half of modern Europe was conquered, Christianized, organized, Latinized, and alphabetized. He dabbled in laws, letters, and learning like a barbarian Socrates. He created a palace school. He standardized scripts. He bathed, occasionally. The man could fight like a bear and think like a monk, which is a terrifying combination. He also had a long white beard, an affinity for sausages, and at least 18 children by multiple women. History got weirdly quiet on the exact number, and in the year 800, on Christmas Day, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope himself. But don't call it a comeback. Charlemagne invented the comeback. After all, the Roman Empire was supposed to be dead. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. So what makes this man the father of Europe? Why does he haunt textbooks and church walls and oddly elaborate metal statues in town squares? Well, that's the story you're about to hear. It's a tale of war, love, betrayal, baptism by sword, popes with political agendas, rebellious pagans, overly enthusiastic monks, and a king who may or may not have turned into a mythical sleeper, waiting under a mountain for the day Europe needs him again. You know, typical bedtime stuff. The boy who would be hammered before he was Charlemagne, he was just Charles, a baby with an overachieving dad and a terrifyingly famous grandpa. Let's start with that grandfather, Charles Martel, aka the Hammer. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a message. Martel famously smashed invading Muslim armies at the Battle of Tours in 732 and became a heroic poster boy for Christian Europe's survival. He was, in short, a very big deal. The kind of guy who didn't just win battles, he created dynasties. But here's the thing. Charles Martel never actually became king. He was mayor of the palace, a sort of prime minister/puppet master, who controlled the Frankish kingdoms while the Merovingian kings sat around combing their hair. That's not a joke. They were called the long-haired kings. Martel's son, Pepin the Short, had bigger ambitions. Yes, that was his actual name, and yes, he was short. But Pepin didn't let his vertical challenges stop him. In fact, he decided the Merovingians had overstayed their welcome. So he politely asked the Pope, "Hey, if someone does all the work of ruling, shouldn't he be king instead of some lazy hair model?" The Pope, being surrounded by Lombards and in desperate need of some military help, so said, "Absolutely." And just like that, Pepin kicked the last Merovingian out, crowned himself king of the Franks, and made a deal with the church that would echo for centuries. Enter Charles, Pepin's son. No one's quite sure when Charlemagne was born, probably 742 or 747, depending on which monk you ask and how much wine he had that day. But wherever it was, young Charles was born into a world of transition. His family had power, but not full legitimacy. His kingdom was Christian, but still half pagan. The Franks ruled the land, but the church ruled the narrative. And Charles? He was born to bridge the gap. He grew up surrounded by warriors, priests, Latin scrolls, and steel. He was trained in warfare, diplomacy, and scripture, a rare trio. He learned how to fight, how to pray, and how to speak multiple dialects of Latin and Germanic tongue. But one thing he never quite learned to do was write. Yes, the man who would later be crowned Emperor of Rome never quite mastered writing his own name. He tried. His signature looked like the scribble of a confused duck. Still, he was tall, athletic, and fiercely intelligent. He watched his father campaign across Europe, forge alliances with the Pope, and slowly begin carving out what would soon become the Carolingian Empire. And then came the first big drama, Pepin's death. Like any good medieval dad, Pepin left his empire split in two between his sons, Charles and Charlemagne. Charles, the elder and more charismatic, got the western part. Charlemagne, the more secretive and clerical, got the eastern chunk. Think of it like slicing a kingdom down the middle and giving one half to a golden retriever and the other to a paranoid cat. It didn't go well. Charles and Charlemagne did not get along. Their joint rule lasted all of 3 years, with passive-aggressive letters, awkward palace dinners, and territorial pouting. While Charles was out leading armies and building alliances, Charlemagne was busy glaring at him from across the map. But then, in 771, Charlemagne died suddenly. Natural causes, the records say. Nothing suspicious at all. Cue dramatic music. And just like that, Charles inherited the entire Frankish realm. The church supported him. The nobles backed him. The people cheered. Suddenly, the boy born in his grandfather's shadow was now the sole king of the Franks. He had the hammer. He had the throne. And he had some very big plans. Fractured realms and rising kings. The year was 771. Charlemagne was dead. And with his brother's passing, Charles, not yet called the Great, found himself in control of the entire Frankish realm. At just over 25 years old, Charles stood as the sole ruler of the Frankish kingdom, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the edges of Saxony and Lombardy, a kingdom poised between opportunity and danger. His ascension was not entirely smooth. Charlemagne's sudden death left behind a wife, Gerberga, and sons who were too young to rule. They fled south to the Lombard court, seeking protection from King Desiderius, a powerful monarch of northern Italy who had his own reasons for resenting Charles. Desiderius had once been Charles's father-in-law. In one of his early acts as king, Charles had married Desiderata, daughter of the Lombard king, in an attempt to secure peace between the Franks and Lombards. But the marriage was short-lived. Charles repudiated Desiderata and sent her back to her father's court. The political insult cut deep. Now, with Desiderius sheltering Gerberga and her sons, possible claimants to the Frankish throne, a conflict loomed. But before Charles could address the growing threat in Italy, he turned his attention to the south and the west, the Duchy of Aquitaine, which had long resisted Frankish rule. The duchy, sprawling across southwestern Gaul, was wealthy, fiercely independent, and difficult to subdue. Its lords had been a thorn in the side of both Pepin and Charles Martel. Charles now took up the task of breaking its resistance. With military precision, he led campaigns deep into Aquitanian territory, dismantling local opposition, securing key cities, and asserting control over the region. His army moved swiftly, decisively, and without mercy. Those who resisted were captured or executed. Fortresses were razed. Rebellious lords were exiled or imprisoned. By 769, Aquitaine had been brought firmly under Frankish control. The south, for the first time in decades, was pacified. But peace in one region often meant war in another. The Lombard campaign. In 773, Charles turned his attention toward Italy. Desiderius, harboring Charlemagne's widow and sons, refused to hand them over. He also began pressing Pope Hadrian I, urging him to recognize Carlomagne's sons as rightful kings. The Pope refused. Instead, he reached out to Charles, not just as a political ally, but as a protector of the Church. This appeal to divine authority was a powerful lever. Since Pepin's time, the alliance between the Carolingians and the papacy had been rooted in mutual dependency. The Church needed protection from secular threats. The Carolingians needed spiritual legitimacy. Charles answered the Pope's call with swift determination. In the winter of 773, he led his forces across the Alps, one of the most perilous military maneuvers of the age. Snow-choked passes, narrow mountain paths, and harsh winds did not deter the Frankish army. It was a march reminiscent of Hannibal centuries earlier, except this time the invader came to liberate the Pope, not destroy Rome. When Charles descended into the Po Valley, he besieged Pavia, the capital of Lombardy. The siege lasted for months. Supplies dwindled. Starvation crept in. Yet Desiderius held firm. Charles was patient. His forces tightened the blockade, cutting off all escape routes and choking the city's lifelines. Meanwhile, he sent a detachment to Verona, where Carlomagne's family had taken refuge. There, Gerberga and her sons were captured. History loses sight of them after this. Whether they were imprisoned, exiled, or quietly eliminated, their claim to the Frankish crown ended. In 774, Pavia fell. Desiderius was captured and sent into exile. Some accounts claim he was forced to live out his days in a monastery. Charles now claimed the Iron Crown of Lombardy, proclaiming himself king of the Lombards, the first non-Italian to do so. This conquest marked a turning point. Charles was no longer merely a Frankish king. He was now a ruler of two kingdoms, a defender of the Pope, and a dominant force in European politics. His authority extended from the Pyrenees to the Apennines, from the Atlantic to the Alps. But his ambitions were far from satisfied. The Saxon problem. Even as Italy bent to his will, the north and east of his kingdom smoldered with unrest. To the northeast lay Saxony, a wild and forested land of independent tribes and deeply entrenched paganism. The Saxons had long resisted Frankish influence. They practiced their own religion, honored their own gods, especially Irminsul, a sacred pillar believed to connect heaven and earth, and rejected both Frankish rule and Christianity. They were, in every sense, the antithesis of Charles's emerging Christian empire. And Charles, newly crowned protector of the Church, ally of the Pope, and heir to centuries of Roman Christian tradition, saw the Saxon resistance not just as a political threat, but as a spiritual affront. Thus began one of the most brutal, protracted, and defining conflicts of his reign, the Saxon Wars. For over 30 years, from 772 to 804, Charles would wage near constant war against the Saxons. He would return to this frontier again and again, each time trying to force their submission. Each time they rose again, but those early years, just after the fall of the Lombards, were especially pivotal. In 772, Charles launched a full-scale invasion into Saxon territory. He targeted Eresburg, a key stronghold, and there he ordered the destruction of the Irminsul. The sacred tree pillar was chopped down and burned, a symbolic strike against the Saxon gods. It was a calculated act. Charles understood that warfare was not only about arms and soldiers, but symbols and beliefs. By destroying Irminsul, he was declaring war not only on the Saxons, but on their entire way of life. The Saxons, however, did not capitulate. They retreated into the forests and struck back with ferocity. The war would become a bitter cycle: invasions, forced baptisms, uprisings, massacres, and retaliations. This was not a war of kingdoms, it was a war of conversion and resistance, diplomacy and marriage. Even as he fought in Italy and Saxony, Charles pursued diplomacy in other corners of Europe. He forged alliances with Christian rulers in Spain, sought peace with the Byzantine Empire, and married for political advantage. After annulling his short-lived marriage to Desiderata, Charles took another wife, Hildegard of Vinskau, a noblewoman of Alemannic descent. Unlike his previous union, this marriage was fruitful and enduring. Hildegard bore him multiple children, including his favored heir, Charles the Younger. Hildegard was a pious, intelligent, and politically astute queen. She accompanied Charles on several of his campaigns, and earned the respect of the court and the clergy alike. Her presence helped cement alliances with powerful Germanic families, and gave Charles legitimacy in the eastern regions of his empire. Through warfare and diplomacy, conquest and marriage, Charles was weaving together a realm that had no equal in Western Europe. But the kingdom he ruled was not yet an empire. That transformation would come later, not with a sword, but with a crown, and a moment that would echo through 1,000 years of European history. For now, Charles ruled, but soon he would reign, sword and scripture. Charlemagne's Holy War, the conquest and Christianization of Saxony. In the Frankish imagination, Saxony was more than a distant rebellious frontier. It was a land of darkness, spiritual, cultural, and civilizational. To the Franks, the Saxons were wild men of the forests, pagans who clung to ancient gods, resisted kingship, and lived without law. They worshipped in groves, not cathedrals. They ruled by tribal consensus, not royal command, and most offensively, they rejected baptism. To Charlemagne, king of the Franks and son of the Church, this was unacceptable. As early as 772, he declared his intention not only to subjugate the Saxon lands, but to convert the Saxon people. The wars that followed would not be waged for territory alone. They would be waged for souls, with steel, fire, and cross. The first campaigns, the war began with symbolism. In the summer of 772, Charles marched into Saxony and captured Eresburg, a fortified hilltop site. There, he destroyed the Irminsul, the sacred pillar revered by Saxon tribes as a cosmic axis, a direct connection between their gods and the earth. By tearing it down, Charles hoped to break their spiritual resistance. He did not. The Saxons retaliated with lightning raids across the Rhine, burning churches and killing Christian missionaries. These were not coordinated armies, but loose tribal confederations, each clan fighting with axes, spears, and burning hatred for Frankish domination. Their leader, or at least the most remembered among them, was Widukind, a charismatic nobleman whose name would become synonymous with Saxon rebellion. For years, the war dragged on with no clear end in sight. Charles would invade, baptize hundreds under threat of execution, and build churches. Then, as soon as his forces withdrew, the Saxons would rise, destroy the churches, kill the priests, and fall back into the woods. Each year, Charles returned. His campaigns followed a grim pattern: swift military strikes, mass conversions, public executions of those who resisted, and the establishment of Frankish garrisons. Forced conversion Charlemagne believed that Christianity was the foundation of civilization, and that the sword could be a tool of salvation. He demanded the Saxons not only submit politically, but accept baptism and the Roman Church. This was not merely missionary work, it was conquest wrapped in religious orthodoxy, and the price of refusal was death. In 782, the war reached its most infamous moment, the massacre of Verdun. That year, after a major Saxon uprising led by Widukind, Charles responded with overwhelming force. He defeated the rebels at the Battle of the Suntal, and ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxons who had been captured or surrendered. At Verdun, they were beheaded in mass, without trial. This act shocked even some of Charles's allies, but for the king, It was not vengeance. It was deterrence. He believed that only absolute fear could break the Saxons' resistance and usher them into the Christian world. The massacre marked a turning point. Widukind fled, likely to Denmark, and Saxon resistance briefly collapsed, but not for long. The unquiet frontier. Throughout the 780s, the Saxon Wars continued. The Franks would suppress one rebellion, only for another to rise. Villages were burned, churches defiled, bishops slain. Paganism did not die easily, nor quietly. Charles implemented a harsh legal code for the region, known as the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae. It was a fusion of military law and Christian doctrine. Under its terms, refusing baptism was punishable by death. Killing a priest, burning a church, or practicing pagan rituals warranted execution. Even minor infractions against Christian customs could lead to exile or forced labor. To modern eyes, it was a ruthless policy of cultural erasure. But to Charlemagne, it was divine order, necessary for the creation of a Christian empire. Over time, as the rebellions grew less frequent and Widukind's influence faded, Frankish control deepened. Monasteries were established in newly pacified regions, becoming both centers of faith and fortresses of cultural dominance. Missionaries, often trained in Francia, flooded into Saxon territory, armed with Latin scriptures and guarded by soldiers. In 785, the turning point came. Widukind surrendered. He accepted baptism at Charles's court in Attigny. The ceremony was not only a religious rite, but a political theater. Widukind knelt before the man who had ordered thousands of his countrymen slain, and Charles himself served as his godfather. To the Franks, it was a triumph. To the Saxons, perhaps, it was surrender under duress. Whatever the truth, Saxony was no longer a free land. Integration and resistance. Even after Widukind's submission, small uprisings continued. In 792, and again in 793, isolated bands rebelled against Frankish authority, but without unified leadership, these were easily suppressed. Over time, Frankish institutions replaced tribal ones. Christian bishops became regional administrators. Laws were written down in Latin, and monasteries served as centers of administration, record-keeping, and cultural transformation. The last major Saxon revolt occurred in 804. Charles responded with decisive brutality. He ordered the mass deportation of thousands of rebellious Saxons into Frankish lands, replacing them with more compliant settlers from other parts of the empire. By the end of the Saxon Wars, the region had been utterly transformed, not only in religion, but in governance, culture, and social structure. Saxony had become part of the Carolingian Empire, and its people, willingly or not, were now Christians. Christian kingship. The Saxon Wars cemented Charles's identity as more than a warlord. He was now a Christian king in the Roman tradition, a ruler whose legitimacy came not only from blood and conquest, but from God. To reinforce this image, Charles began surrounding himself with advisors from across Christendom. He was especially influenced by Alcuin of York, an Anglo-Saxon scholar and cleric who became a central figure in the Carolingian court. Alcuin encouraged Charles to model himself after biblical kings, David, Solomon, Constantine. His role was not just to defend Christendom, but to restore the moral and spiritual order of the world. Charles listened. He sponsored churches, monasteries, and cathedral schools. He issued laws protecting church property and supporting ecclesiastical courts. And he began to articulate an ideal of kingship where the monarch was both shepherd and sword, guiding his people in faith and punishing those who strayed. The empire he envisioned was not merely territorial, it was sacramental, a realm united by belief, law, and divine authority. Aftermath and memory. The Saxon Wars remain among the most controversial chapters in Charlemagne's reign. To some, they represent a militant imposition of Christianity, forced upon a people who had no desire to abandon their gods or customs. The destruction of the Irminsul, the massacre of Verdun, the Capitulatio, these were acts of spiritual imperialism, cloaked in the name of salvation. To others, they were the necessary foundation for European unity. Without the integration of Saxony, the Carolingian Empire could not have held its eastern frontier. Without a Christian Saxony, the spiritual map of Europe might have fragmented. What cannot be denied is the scale of transformation. Within a single generation, a tribal pagan culture had been absorbed, reshaped, and bound into the orbit of a centralized Christian monarchy. Charlemagne had not only expanded his kingdom, he had changed the course of European history. By the year 800, that transformation would culminate in a moment that even he could not have fully foreseen: a coronation in Rome, and the rebirth of an empire thought long dead. Crown of the Romans. The rebirth of an empire, and the king who never sought the title. By the year 799, Charles was no longer merely the king of the Franks and Lombards. He was the dominant force in Western Europe. His empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe River, from the North Sea to central Italy. His enemies had been subdued, his nobles loyal, his court vibrant with scholars and priests. Saxony was Christian, the Pope was indebted. The Church's authority had been preserved through Frankish steel. And yet, the future still held a surprise. One born in a moment of violence and crowned in the heart of ancient Rome. The Pope in peril. In April of 799, Pope Leo III found himself in danger. Rome had always been a city of power struggles, even in its waning days. The papacy, though spiritually supreme, was politically vulnerable. Surrounded by powerful Roman families and corrupt factions who remembered the days when emperors, not popes, ruled the eternal city. Leo, though pious, had enemies among the Roman nobility. They questioned his legitimacy, accused him of moral failings, and sought to depose him by force. On April 25, 799, while riding in a procession outside the city, Leo was attacked by armed conspirators. They dragged him from his horse, beat him savagely, and attempted to blind and mutilate him. Only by the swift action of loyal guards did the Pope escape with his life. Shaken and bloodied, Leo fled Rome and made his way north to Charlemagne. Charles, then in Paderborn in Saxony, received him with honor. The symbolism could not have been more potent. The Pope, head of the Church, now physically and spiritually in the hands of the king, who had defended Christendom for decades. Leo pleaded his case. Charles, ever the pragmatic ruler, saw opportunity. He restored Leo to Rome with an armed escort, convened a council to clear the Pope of all charges, and made it clear: no earthly power would depose a pope without royal consent. But there was more at play than justice. The idea of empire, long dormant in the West, was stirring. The ghost of empire. The Western Roman Empire had officially fallen in 476 AD, when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus. Since then, the imperial legacy had lingered, as idea, as memory, as aspiration. The Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, still claimed the Roman name. Its emperors saw themselves as the sole heirs of Caesar and Augustus. But their influence in the West had long waned. Italy, Gaul, and Germany had passed to barbarian kings and feudal lords. Now, in Charles, many saw a chance for revival. A new emperor, not born in Rome, but reborn through faith, conquest, and Christian unity. Charles himself never openly campaigned for the title. He was wary of provoking Constantinople and cautious of altering the delicate balance of power between church and crown. But Pope Leo had no such hesitations. He needed a protector. He needed a power greater than the Roman nobility, and above all, he needed a king to legitimize his own authority. And so, on Christmas Day, in the year 800, in the old Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, Charlemagne entered history in a way no one, perhaps not even he, fully expected. The coronation. The basilica was packed with clergy, nobility, and guards. Candles burned in every alcove. Incense thickened the air. Choirs sang in Latin as Charles approached the altar in prayer. Then, at the climactic moment, Pope Leo III stepped forward, holding a golden crown, and placed it on the kneeling king's head. With a loud voice, Leo proclaimed, "To Charles, the most serene Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific Emperor of the Romans, life and victory." The crowd erupted in acclamation. The empire, dead for more than 3 centuries in the West, was reborn. Charlemagne was now emperor. Later accounts claim Charles was taken by surprise, that had he known of Leo's plan, he would not have entered the church that day. Whether true or not, the coronation became a foundational myth of Western kingship. A ruler chosen by God, crowned by the Pope, acclaimed by the people. A new order had been established. A Holy Roman Empire, not Roman in language or blood, but in legacy, faith, and power. The political earthquake. The coronation sent shockwaves through Europe and beyond. To the Franks, it was a moment of triumph. Their king had become the emperor of a Christian world, elevated not by bloodline, but by virtue and divine right. He now stood as heir to the Caesars, not by Roman birth, but by Christian destiny. To the Byzantines, it was an insult. The Empress Irene, ruling from Constantinople at the time, did not recognize Charles's title. From her court's perspective, the Roman Empire already had a sovereign, her. The Pope had no right to grant that title to anyone else. Diplomatic tensions rose. Charles wrote cautiously to Constantinople, proposing marriage alliances and mutual recognition. Eventually, a fragile peace was agreed upon. Charles was acknowledged not as Emperor of the Romans, but as Emperor of the West. A subtle but important distinction. The political map of Europe had changed. 2 empires now stood in Christendom, one in the east, Greek-speaking and ancient, the other in the west, Latin-speaking and newly crowned. For the Church, the coronation was a turning point. It cemented the idea that spiritual authority could grant secular power, that kings ruled by God's will, channeled through the papacy. For Charlemagne, the title brought both prestige and burden. He now bore responsibility not only for ruling, but for restoring Roman civilization, and he took that mission seriously. The empire consolidated as emperor. Charles governed an empire that was vast, diverse, and fragile. His challenge was no longer simply conquest. It was administration, unification, and preservation. He divided his empire into counties, each governed by a count appointed by the crown. These local rulers administered justice, collected taxes, and led military forces. But they were watched closely by royal envoys, the Missi Dominici, who traveled in pairs, one lay noble, one cleric, to inspect each region and report directly to the king. He standardized weights and measures, introduced a new silver coinage system, and ensured that royal decrees were copied and distributed across his realm. He also issued a great many capitularies, written royal edicts, laying out laws, church policy, land reform, and court procedures. This was not the anarchy of barbarian rule. This was something closer to governance, rooted in Roman law, Christian ethics, and Carolingian ambition. Rome in the mind. Yet Charles never moved his capital to Rome. Though crowned emperor there, he ruled primarily from Aachen, a city near the German border, where he built a grand palace complex and a chapel modeled after Byzantine churches. His empire was Roman in title, but Frankish in heart, and that dual identity would define the centuries to come. He preserved the Roman ideal, order, justice, majesty, but rooted it in Christian soil. For Charles, to be emperor was not only to rule, but to reform, uplift, and guide. And though the title was newly revived, it bore an ancient weight. He now followed in the shadow of Augustus, Constantine, Justinian, a lineage of emperors who shaped the world. Charlemagne would shape it again, court of the great king, the palace at Aachen, the rebirth of learning, and the forging of a Christian intellectual world. After the wars were quiet, after the crowns were claimed and the empire knit together by blood and vows, Charlemagne turned his gaze inward. He had unified lands, crushed rebellion, defended the church, and taken the title of emperor. Now he faced a subtler, but no less formidable challenge. To govern a Christian empire, one needed Christian minds. The Franks had swords, yes, but they lacked scholars, judges, priests, and administrators fluent in the scriptures, in Latin, in law. Across much of Europe, knowledge had crumbled alongside Rome's ruins. Monasteries decayed. Latin became fractured and barely intelligible. Few could read, fewer could write, and almost no one outside the clergy could interpret sacred texts. Charlemagne believed that this intellectual poverty endangered both the soul of his empire and the future of Christendom. And so he did something no Frankish king had done before him. He called for a renaissance. The palace at Aachen. At the heart of this rebirth was Aachen, Charlemagne's chosen capital. Located near modern-day Germany's western border, it sat atop natural hot springs, a city both strategic and serene. There, Charles ordered the construction of a grand palace complex, which included a royal residence, government buildings, courtyards, gardens, and most importantly, the Palatine Chapel. Inspired by Byzantine architecture, particularly Ravenna's San Vitale, the chapel at Aachen was an architectural marvel. Its octagonal dome and marble columns echoed imperial Rome, while its Christian mosaics declared that this was now a holy capital of a reborn empire. But Aachen was not only a seat of power, it became a school of wisdom. At the center of it all was the Palace School, a gathering of the finest minds from across the Christian world, invited by Charles to educate his court, his clergy, and even himself. And at its head stood Alcuin of York. Alcuin and the scholars. Alcuin was an English monk and scholar from Northumbria, trained in the tradition of Bede and Isidore. Charlemagne met him in Italy in the 780s, and recognizing his brilliance, persuaded him to move to Aachen. Alcuin became not only the chief teacher of the palace school, but a friend and spiritual advisor to the emperor. With Alcuin came others: Theodulf of Orleans, a Visigothic poet and bishop; Paulinus of Aquileia, an Italian theologian; Einard, Charles's biographer and court intellectual. Together, they formed the nucleus of a cultural revival that would stretch from monastery to monastery across the realm. They reformed schools. They copied ancient texts. They trained priests and nobles in grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, and theology, the liberal arts of Christian civilization. Alcuin's motto for the movement was clear: Renovatio Imperii Romani, renewal of the Roman Empire, but not through conquest, through learning. The Carolingian Renaissance. This flowering of culture is now known as the Carolingian Renaissance, the first of three medieval renaissances, and a critical bridge between antiquity and the later flourishing of medieval scholarship. Its impacts were profound. 1. Script reform. Carolingian minuscule. Perhaps the most influential and least glamorous of the reforms was the development of a new writing system, Carolingian minuscule. Prior to this, Latin texts were written in cramped, inconsistent scripts that varied from region to region. They were difficult to read, prone to errors, and often incomprehensible even to other monks. Under Charlemagne's direction, Scribes were taught to use a clear, uniform, and legible script, with spaces between words, punctuation, and capital letters. It revolutionized the copying of texts and ensured that Latin, the language of the church and law, remained intelligible and standardized across the empire. Many of the classical manuscripts we have today, Virgil, Cicero, Augustine, survived only because Carolingian scribes copied them with such care and clarity. Second, educational reform. Charlemagne issued capitularies mandating the education of priests and monks. He demanded they be literate, capable of reading the Bible, and able to explain its meaning to their flocks. Monasteries were restructured as centers of learning. Scriptoria, rooms devoted to copying manuscripts, were established. Schools were attached to cathedrals, monasteries, and royal courts. The goal was ambitious: to educate the clergy, uplift the nobility, and preserve Christian knowledge for future generations. Third, legal and liturgical standardization. Charles saw disorder in the law as disorder in the realm. He commissioned the collection, codification, and revision of various Germanic legal codes, merging them with Roman and Christian principles. Likewise, liturgy, the structure of Christian worship, was unified across the empire. Chanting practices were standardized, early precursors to what would become Gregorian chant. Feast days synchronized, and rituals aligned with Roman custom. The church and the state moved toward administrative harmony. The king, as student Charlemagne, was no passive patron of learning. Though illiterate in youth and never fully fluent in writing, he was a tireless student. He studied Latin and Greek. He read theology and history. He surrounded himself with scholars, asking questions, engaging in debates, and attending lessons. Einhard, his courtier and biographer, later wrote, "He tried to write and used to keep tablets and notebooks under his pillow, so that in his leisure hours he might accustom his hand to forming the letters. But his effort came too late in life and failed to achieve success. Yet this pursuit of wisdom became central to his identity. He was not merely a warrior king, but a philosopher ruler, modeled after Solomon and Constantine. In this way, Charles forged a new ideal of kingship, not only defender of the realm, but teacher of the people." The limits of Renaissance. Despite these advances, the Carolingian Renaissance was not a revolution for all. Its reach extended mostly to monasteries and courts. Most peasants remained illiterate. Education for women, though present in some convents, was limited, and the intellectual movement did not revive ancient science or philosophy to the degree the later Italian Renaissance would. But what it did achieve was stabilization, a reclamation of Christian knowledge, a reconnection to Roman law, and a cultural infrastructure that would support Europe for centuries to come. A legacy of learning. By the end of Charlemagne's reign, thousands of manuscripts had been copied. Hundreds of schools had been established. Dozens of bishops and abbots had been trained under the new order. The effects would echo long after the empire fractured. Later reformers, like Otto the Great, Cluny's monks, and the founders of the University of Paris, all traced their lineage to the Carolingian model. Charlemagne, in forging an empire with both sword and scripture, left a world not only more unified, but more aware of its past. He may not have written his own name fluently, but through the works he commissioned, the scholars he supported, and the systems he built, his name, Carolus Magnus, was inscribed upon history. The man behind the Majesty Charlemagne's personality, habits, family, contradictions, and legacy as a human being, history often sculpts emperors into statues, rigid, awe-inspiring, but bloodless. Charlemagne was no statue. Beneath the imperial robes was a living soul, complicated and full of contrast. Those who knew him described a man of towering presence, both literally and figuratively. Einhard, his close companion and chronicler, left us the most vivid portrait, not just of a ruler, but of a human being. His appearance. Charles was large and strong, and of lofty stature. The top of his head was round, his eyes very large and animated, his nose rather long, his hair fair, and his face laughing and merry. Einhard, Vita Caroli, Magni Charlemagne, stood over 6 feet tall, a giant among early medieval men. His frame was broad, his legs powerful from riding, and he bore himself like a warrior. His beard was short and neat, his hair long and flowing, and he had an intense, intelligent gaze. He had no interest in ostentatious fashion. He dressed like a common Frankish noble, a linen shirt, woolen tunic, belt, and leather boots. Only on major church holidays did he wear Roman-style robes and golden sandals. He disliked foreign dress and refused to be seen in the silks of the East. Simplicity, dignity, and function. These were the virtues of his wardrobe, and in many ways of his worldview. His daily life. Charlemagne's daily routine reflected his belief in discipline, piety, and moderation. He woke early, usually before dawn, and began with prayer. He attended Mass daily, even on campaign, and often led his entourage in chanting psalms. He ate simply. His typical breakfast was bread soaked in wine. For lunch, he preferred roasted meats, vegetables, and fruit. He disliked drunkenness, though he was fond of wine in moderation. He loathed gluttony, but indulged a legendary sweet tooth for roasted apples and honey. He bathed regularly, a luxury in those days, and had a particular fondness for hot springs, especially those at Aachen. He often held meetings while bathing, conducting affairs of state with his ministers in steaming pools. He loved the outdoors. He rode, hunted, and exercised almost daily, even into old age. His physical stamina was matched by mental endurance. He worked long hours, presided over disputes, heard ambassadors, and discussed scripture with bishops. At night, he dined with family and scholars. He listened to readings, histories, sermons, or classical Latin texts. He detested vulgar songs, but enjoyed tales of old kings and Christian martyrs. His education and intellect. Charlemagne was not born literate. Few nobles of his day were, but he pursued knowledge with relentless energy. He spoke Latin fluently and could understand some Greek. He memorized scripture and took pride in theological debates. Though he could not write well, he practiced with wax tablets at night. He had a remarkable memory and a love of learning that shaped the soul of his empire. He founded libraries, sponsored translations, and even tried to learn astronomy, though, according to Einhard, he never quite mastered the course of the stars. He was no philosopher king in the mold of Plato, but neither was he a brutish warlord. He was an intellectually curious warrior with a moral vision. His faith. Charlemagne's Christianity was deep and sincere, if occasionally harsh by modern standards. He prayed constantly, gave to the poor, founded churches, and sought to bring Christ to every corner of his realm. He saw himself as a shepherd of souls, not just a monarch. He wept at Mass, listened to monks with reverence, and demanded that his children be pious. But his faith had teeth. He could be ruthless in enforcing orthodoxy, executing those who refused baptism, destroying pagan shrines, and persecuting heresy. For Charlemagne, unity in the church was as essential as unity in the state, and he would preserve both with fire and steel if necessary. In his eyes, empire and faith were one mission: to restore the glory of Rome in the name of Christ. His family and personal life. Charlemagne married at least 5 times and took several concubines. His wives included Himmeltrude, possibly a concubine, mother of his first son, Pepin the Hunchback; Desiderata, daughter of the Lombard king, whom he divorced after a year; Hildegard of Swabia, his most beloved wife, with whom he had 9 children; Fastrada, a Frankish noblewoman, politically savvy but unpopular at court; Luitgard, his final wife, who outlived him only briefly. He had at least 18 children, though some sources say more. He was deeply devoted to his children. He personally supervised their education and refused to send his daughters away in marriage, preferring to keep them at court. This shocked his contemporaries and gave rise to rumors of impropriety, though no credible evidence supports those claims. His daughters were cultured, intelligent, and widely admired. They participated in court life, sang at banquets, and were often involved in politics and religious affairs. Charlemagne's protectiveness may have stemmed from genuine affection or from a desire to keep dynastic alliances under his control. His sons were groomed for power, but with uneven results. Pepin the Hunchback rebelled and was sent to a monastery. Charles the Younger and Pepin of Italy predeceased him. Only Louis the Pious survived to inherit the empire. His temperament Charlemagne was not easily angered, but once roused, he could be ferocious. He punished betrayal harshly, whether from nobles, clergy, or his own blood. He was just but firm, generous to the poor, but stern with the arrogant. He had little patience for deceit or cowardice. He laughed often, enjoyed games, and was known for good humor in private. But he also carried the weight of empire with deep solemnity. He mourned his children's deaths bitterly. He fasted in penitence when wars dragged on too long. In old age, he walked with a heavy step, not only from illness, but from the burden of holding the Christian world together. His view of death. As he aged, Charlemagne felt death approaching. The empire was large, his sons too few, and Europe still dangerous. He prepared for the end with stoic calm. He strengthened the church, trained his heir Louis, and composed a will dividing his treasures, not just among family, but among churches, monasteries, and the poor. He died in 814 at age 72, after a final illness of fever and pleurisy. He was buried in the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, seated upright on a marble throne, crowned, sword in hand, dressed in imperial robes, like a Roman emperor of old. The man remembered Charlemagne's image lived on, not just in statues, but in legend. Medieval France called him Saint Charlemagne. Germany claimed him as Karl der Grosse. The Holy Roman emperors styled themselves successors to Charlemagne. The Church never formally canonized him, but Aachen venerated him as a saint for centuries. Even Napoleon, 1,000 years later, sought to emulate Charlemagne, not just in conquest, but in mythic stature. But beneath the myth was still the man, a barbarian warlord and Christian emperor, a devoted father and unrepentant conqueror, a flawed believer striving toward divine justice, a man who tried, in a dark and chaotic world, to raise light from ruin, death and division, the fall of empire, the succession, fragmentation, and afterlife of Charlemagne's legacy. When Charlemagne died in 814, he left behind a continent reshaped by will and war, a new Rome in the west, forged from chaos. But empires, like men, are mortal, and while the name Charlemagne would resound for centuries, the empire he built would begin to crack the moment the throne grew cold. The heir, Louis the Pious. Charlemagne's surviving son, Louis the Pious, inherited the imperial crown, but not his father's iron resolve. Where Charlemagne was pragmatic and commanding, Louis was idealistic, deeply religious, and prone to indecision. He was called the Pious for good reason. He wept at sermons, retreated to monasteries, and sought to rule with the moral purity of a monk. This made him a virtuous man, but a vulnerable emperor. To his credit, Louis was no weakling. He enforced reforms, protected the church, and tried to maintain the unity of the realm. But the forces pulling Europe apart, tribal loyalties, noble ambition, family rivalries, had only been held at bay by Charlemagne's personal authority. Now they began to erupt. The fatal division Charlemagne had avoided splitting the empire during his lifetime, even though it went against Frankish tradition. He had buried sons, disinherited rebels, and given everything to Louis. But Louis, believing fairness was godly, decided to divide the empire among his sons. A fatal miscalculation. In 817, he issued the Ordinatio Imperii, a decree to preserve imperial unity under his eldest Lothair, while granting sub-kingdoms to his younger sons, Pepin and Louis the German. The plan was complicated and fragile, and when his fourth son, Charles the Bald, was born by a second wife, everything unraveled. Infighting followed. Sons rebelled against their father. Brothers turned on one another. The empire descended into civil war. Charlemagne's vision of a unified Christian imperium began to dissolve into feuding kingdoms. The Treaty of Verdun, 843. After years of brutal warfare, the heirs of Charlemagne reached an uneasy peace in 843 with the Treaty of Verdun. It split the Carolingian Empire into three parts. West Francia, given to Charles the Bald, it would eventually become France. East Francia, given to Louis the German, it would evolve into Germany. Middle Francia, given to Lothair, including the imperial title and a long strip of land from the North Sea to Rome. It was too diverse, too vulnerable, and would soon fragment. This treaty is often considered the birth certificate of modern Europe, because from it arose distinct nations, France and Germany, who would shape the continent's fate. But it also marked the death of the unified empire Charlemagne had forged with blood and prayer. The Viking storm. As the Carolingian heirs squabbled, new dangers emerged from the seas. In the 9th century, Vikings descended from Scandinavia. Savage, swift, and nearly unstoppable, they pillaged monasteries, torched towns, and sailed up rivers with terrifying ease. Charlemagne had begun to build defenses, but his successors were overwhelmed. Paris was besieged. Aachen looted. The great structures of Charlemagne's realm burned beneath Norse torches. At the same time, Muslims from North Africa attacked from the south, and Magyars, early Hungarians, raided from the east. Europe had become a battleground once again, its borders fraying, its kings shrinking behind castle walls. The fall of the Carolingians. Though the Carolingians lingered as figureheads for another century, their actual power faded quickly. In West Francia, local counts became hereditary lords, growing in independence and ambition. Eventually, in 987, the Carolingians were overthrown by Hugh Capet, founder of the Capetian dynasty, and the Carolingians were no more in France. In East Francia, the royal title passed to the Ottonians, who claimed the imperial crown in 962, not as heirs of the Carolingians, but as reborn Romans. Thus began the Holy Roman Empire, a title echoing Charlemagne's dream, but in a different key. The Middle Kingdom, Lothair's slice of empire, was too divided to endure. It splintered into duchies, counties, and contested territories. Many of the modern borders of Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Italy trace their chaotic beginnings to this imperial graveyard. The legacy and memory. While the empire fractured, Charlemagne's image grew stronger in death than in life. He became a legend, a mythic king, the embodiment of Christendom's golden age. His name echoed in song, sermon, and story for centuries. In France, he was revered as the founder of the nation, his battles celebrated in the Chanson de Geste, especially the Song of Roland, where his exploits were exaggerated into epic sagas. In Germany, he became Karl der Grosse, the mighty Teutonic emperor, a forefather of future Kaisers. The Catholic Church held him up as a model Christian king, even venerating him as a saint in Aachen, where pilgrims visited his throne and relics. The Holy Roman Emperors, crowned in Rome, took the name Charles in his honor, Charles IV, Charles V, seeking to claim his mantle and revive his empire. Even Napoleon, over 1,000 years later, modeled his rule after Charlemagne. taking the imperial crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head, just as Charles had done. The long view: was the empire a failure? It's easy to see Charlemagne's empire as a brief blaze, a candle in the dark that flared and died within a generation. But to measure his achievement by the lifespan of his crown is to miss the seeds he planted. He created a framework of Christian kingship that shaped medieval Europe. He preserved and transmitted classical knowledge through monasteries and schools. He tied Latin culture and the Catholic Church to the fabric of Europe, rooting the West in a shared spiritual and cultural identity. He gave birth, indirectly, to the very nations, France, Germany, Italy, that would shape the world. In a time of darkness, he built a vision, and while the building crumbled, the vision endured. The bones beneath Aachen. Charlemagne's final resting place, the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, became a site of imperial pilgrimage. He was entombed not in a coffin, but seated on a throne, sword in hand, crowned, gazing forward. In 1000 AD, Emperor Otto III opened the tomb, and found him still seated, remarkably preserved, as if waiting. It was said that his nails had grown into the wood, that his gaze was undimmed. His remains were later moved to a golden shrine, his throne placed behind the altar, his sword kept as a relic of empire. Even in death, Charlemagne sat among kings, a reminder of a unity lost and longed for. Epilogue: the shadow of the emperor. Charlemagne never called himself the Great. That title was given by history. He did not think of himself as a founder of Europe or a unifier of nations. He saw himself simply as a Christian king, doing his duty before God, to protect the church, to bring order, to shepherd his people. And yet, from those convictions, he built something larger than himself, a vision that outlived the empire, outlasted the dynasties, and helped birth Western civilization. In every crown, cathedral, and constitution that followed, the shadow of Charlemagne stretched long and deep. He was not a perfect man. He ruled with both sword and prayer, with blood and parchment. He was complex, brutal yet just, devout yet political, a warrior who loved learning, a father who ruled an empire. But in the darkest corner of the early Middle Ages, he lit a fire, and for that, the world remembered him. Forevermore, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, Pater Europae, Father of Europe.